All right, so I'm trying to get it to load here. All right. So during this class, we'll talk about a few different parts of Buddhism. You know, this is just an hour and a half. Some people study one religion or one tiny aspect of a religion for their entire lives. And this is just going to be an introduction to a few different parts. We're going to talk a little bit about Buddhism in context, where it kind of comes from, and both historically and geographically. We'll also talk about a few stories from the life of the Buddha. We'll also go into a little bit of detail about some of the major sects of Buddhism with a few of their beliefs and practices. And then at the end, I'll suggest a few books if you are interested in further reading. And, you know, like I mentioned, if you have anything to add or any questions or anything along those lines, feel free to provide those in the chat or just speak up. So a couple of definitions here that I do want to start off with, because they come up again and again in Buddhist stories, is the first is samsara, which is the cycle of death and rebirth in Buddhism. If you see this wheel on the right here, that is called the Wheel of Samsara, and it's basically about in a lot of South Asian religions, there is a belief in rebirth and death that continues on. Based on how you live your life, you may be reborn, you know, in a better circumstance or a worse circumstance. Buddha is a term. It's a title, really, and it's not really just for one person. You know, we're going to be talking mostly about a specific Buddha, but Buddha means awakened one, and it basically means someone who has reached nirvana, which is the third definition here, which means that you have reached the goal to stop going through the cycle of rebirth and death. Just letting a few people in. All right, so I'm gonna keep moving on here. So Buddhism, well, Siddhartha Gautama, who we'll be talking about as the Buddha that most people know of, he comes around in the 5th or 4th century CE. If you were part of the last couple of classes, we talked about how Zoroaster and some of the early Chinese religions and philosophers, the dates become a little muddled. History works a little differently the further back you go. The specific dates don't matter in the same way as they do today to us. So Siddhartha Gautama is born in modern day Nepal, in ancient India, and I'll have a map a little later to kind of get some context about that. He's born from the Shakya clan, which is sort of it's a tribe of sorts in ancient India, and he is often called the Shakyamuni Buddha or just Shakyamuni, which basically means of the Shakya tribe. He is also born of an upper class family, which, you know, when we read a lot of our religious stories, that is different. A lot of the founders of many religions come from a background of poverty or lack of education. Well, the Siddhartha Gautama comes from an upper class family. And in context, Buddhism arises at a time and a place where there's a few different religious traditions that are surrounding there. Hinduism and Jainism are the two most popular at this time. Hinduism is the dominant religion in many ways, and it's still pretty dominant in India. But Jainism, which we haven't discussed in this class at all, also is around. All three circle themselves around some of the same questions, but provide different answers to those questions. We'll probably have a class about Jainism in the future, but I think one thing to know about them is that they really preach asceticism, which is when you try to avoid eating as much and sleeping as much, try to restrict your wants in this life. This is also in China, which is not very far from this area. You do have Confucianism and Taoism taking some root all at the same time. So what we're going to do here first is to talk about the life of the Buddha. And so we start with his mother, right? The story goes that Queen Maya, who is the queen of the Shakya tribe, she receives a dream while she's sleeping, and a great white elephant comes to her and impregnates her, and it's a dream here. And the next day she finds that she is pregnant. So there's this belief that there's a bit of a miraculous pregnancy, and she recognizes this as a religious vision of sorts, that this child will be something great. So she carries Siddhartha for about 10 months, and when she's on her way to her parents, she finds that she's about to give birth, and she grabs onto a tree, the branches of a tree, and she gives birth from her side, which again is a miraculous birth. And Siddhartha comes out and he walks 7 steps, and he says, "I am born for the good of the world, and this will be my last birth in the samsaric realm." So that's a beautiful birth story. Has some similarities to a few of the Abrahamic religions also. As a child in Islam, Jesus speaks, and there's some other stories in some of the Abrahamic religions. So as the Buddha, he's not the Buddha yet, actually, but we'll get to that a little later. Siddhartha grows up, and when he's brought to the palace for the first time, brought with his mother to the palace, his father, the king, brings him to the astrologers, and he asks them, what should I know about the future of my son? And the astrologers say that this boy will reach his goals. He will reach his goals. And the Siddhartha comes from the word to reach goals. So, but he asks again, what does the future have in store for my son? And he, the astrologers confer with each other, and they say that it's unclear. He can be one of 2 futures. One is he can embrace the world and become a king like you. And the second is he can forsake the world and become a religious teacher. And the king says, I need him to be a king. How do I make him a king? How do I make sure that he becomes a king? And the astrologers are all in agreement. You must keep him from the world, keep him with the palace, make sure that he has wonderful food, wonderful clothes, sees no illness, no death, no age, and is just living a life of material perfection. And he will not want to go, and when it's his time to become king, then he can see the world. So Siddhartha grows up, and when he reaches the age of 29, he leaves the house with a servant, and he does it kind of without the permission of his father, the king. And when he goes through town, the first person he sees is someone who is elderly, and he says, "Oh my, people age, right?" And he keeps going, and he finds the second person who is ill, who has some health concerns, and he doesn't understand it. You know, this is a type of suffering. And then the third person he sees is dead. They're being brought to their place to be cremated. And he is very disturbed by all this. You know, he lives such a life of cloistering, you know, of not seeing any of this pain and suffering, that he is deeply disturbed. And on his way back, he sees one pretty happy person, and that person is an ascetic, like the man on the left here, who is meditating and seems pretty satisfied with his life. So he decides that he thinks about this experience for quite some time, about a year. And when he's 30, he decides, you know, I am going to pursue this. He leaves his family and decides to be a religious person. So his first experiences, he has two teachers who teach him how to meditate. Meditation is a popular ritual in Hinduism and other South Asian traditions, also not just Buddhism. And he finds them very beautiful. He finds the meditation very, very wonderful. But as he continues to do it, he feels great while he's doing the meditation. But as soon as he leaves the meditation, he feels all the discomfort again. So he continues to seek. He leaves that teacher for another teacher. This happens again, and he leaves that teacher for a third time. And this third teacher, Siddhartha decides that he needs someone who is stronger in his religious practices. So he goes with the most ascetic person he can find. He finds a person who, you know, eats just a couple grains of rice a day, you know, barely drinks, barely sleeps, because they believe that, you know, distancing yourself from the world was the way to find the truth. So Siddhartha tries this, and he becomes increasingly frustrated that it's not working the way he wanted it to. When he reaches a certain point where he is just kind of too angry, if you will, he decides that he will, he's going to reframe how he views it. And in this photo here, this is when he is an ascetic, and he comes to an idea during this that is important, and that's that his cloistered life of privilege was not perfect. It did not get rid of his suffering. He did not feel complete in his life of privilege. And then, but also with the life of asceticism, he did not feel complete. He did not feel satisfied. So he realizes that the proper way might be the middle way, a balance between the two, a balance between forsaking the world and embracing it. And a group of 5 people who are interested in having a teacher come up to him, and they sort of make fun of him, if you will, for not really diving deep into asceticism. Are you just kind of taking the easy way out with your practice by taking a more middle path? So in the last phase before he becomes the Buddha, he decides, I have gone through this process for a few years now. I feel that I know what I need to do to reach enlightenment, to reach the truth. So I am going to make a commitment that I'm going to sit under this Bodhi tree, this tree, until I become enlightened, or until I die. So he sits under this tree, and over the course of about a day, he has an enlightenment experience and realizes that he has become what he set out to be. So before I move on, does anyone have any questions or things to add that they have heard about any of this? Well, feel free to add anything in the chat or speak up if you have anything to add. So he decides that after he's enlightened, he has to think about it a little bit. He has to think, what am I going to do now? I've reached my goal. And one of the questions that he has the most difficulty answering is, should I teach other people this path? Is this something that was just for me? And he takes about 2 months to think about this. And he does decide to say, if I find meaning in this, then maybe others will too. So I'm going to go and travel to teach people. On his way to traveling to teaching people, he comes across one man who notices that he's different. And he asks, the man asks Siddhartha, that, are you a god? And Siddhartha says, I am not a god. I am awake. I am enlightened. And he continues on and continues to teach to people. But one of his first teachings that he teaches those who will listen is to not accept teachings that fall into certain categories. Don't accept anything because it is said to be revelation. Don't accept anything because it's said to be traditional. Don't accept anything because it's hearsay. Don't accept anything because it comes from sacred texts. Don't accept anything because it's logical or rational. Don't accept anything because you agree with it after reflecting on it. Don't accept anything because the teacher is competent or held in high regard. He says to only accept it when you know for yourself that these things are wholesome, blameless, and when undertaken, lead to benefit in practice. So this teaching has actually influenced a lot of ways people analyze things. Philosophically, we call this the pragmatic reality of truth, which is simply that if it is rational and it has a good result, then it is truthful. So he starts with that, and it doesn't mean that these other pieces are wrong, but that that's a lot of people like to argue that one of these ways is the way you find truth. And he's saying, no, not any of these on their own lead to that truth. So it would not be a Buddhism class of any kind if you did not learn about the Four Noble Truths, which is the core of Buddhism's belief system, really. This is something that literally every Buddhist agrees with, that this is the core. And they are these Four Noble Truths. The first is the truth of suffering, which is also called dukkha. And dukkha doesn't really translate quite properly with suffering. It's somewhere between suffering and disappointment. It's a suffering that lasts. It's a suffering that we feel in some respects at every moment. This kind of vague frustration that we haven't reached what we want to. So that first truth is that life is suffering. The second is the cause of suffering, or samudaya, and that is that suffering is caused by desire. As we want things, that creates a system where we cannot be satisfied. We suffer because we want. The third is nirodha, or the cessation of suffering, which means that suffering stops when desire stops. But we all know that desire is a pretty human or animal instinct. It's a pretty natural way of life that, I eat too many brownies personally, that I don't need to eat, but it's very hard to stop desiring them. It's beyond just not eating them. It's the actual want that can be frustrating, right? So, but how do you stop this suffering? Well, the Buddha says the path to cessation of suffering is to stop desire. You must follow the Eightfold Path. And if you've been to this class last time, we went through these a little bit in talking about Chinese religious culture. And, their right understanding, intent, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. So in practice, it appears that this is the piece in some ways that creates debates, if you will, between different Buddhist groups. What is the right understanding? What is the right intent? How do I do the right speech or action? What is the proper balance in all of these things, and how does that lead me closer to my duty in life? Are there any other questions at this point, or does anyone have any comments? Do you see any overlap in your own traditions with Buddhism at this point?
I guess I can say something about that, about the Eighth Path.
Yep.
Carmela, sorry I missed your class last week. In Judaism, there's a lot of things that are parallel to those eight concepts. One is you don't judge someone unless you have the full story, or you really walk in their shoes. So that, I think, has similar to understanding. Right intent is really when you do a good deed, there need to be a good intent in what you do. It's not just the doing, but it has to be heartful, and also the intent of what you do. right speech is that in Judaism it says silent is gold. Best to really keep quiet because a word basically can kill someone. So you got to be very cautious with the way you speak. Right action is that before you act, um, you really have to pause, think, and then do it. Because a lot of the time, when you hold yourself up, you're more likely not to do things. Especially when it comes to dealing with emotions, with anger, with stuff like right livelihood. Um, it's okay to have a lot of material. It's okay to have a lot of stuff, but just for the sake of appreciation of the gallery, not for just to show off. You know, I guess right effort and right intent and category. Right mindfulness, the mindfulness used with the intent, usually when you pray, when you do meditation, and when you ask for things, if it's for yourself, for your family, for the world. So mindfulness, for me would also go with the intent, and also with concentration. When you focus on something and when you put your mind into it and you put the intent into it, many times you do have the power to manifest it. That's why we pray 3 times a day, actually to manifest good intent and good thought and good behavior, good deeds.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Jeremy?
Yeah.
This is Joan. I forgot how to virtually raise my hand. So I just have a question. I missed the class last week. I wasn't aware of it. So I'm going to go ahead and jump here and ask a dumb question. So if life is suffering, is our goal to prevent suffering or accept it?
Our goal is to...
Or Buddhist goal?
It's to kind of destroy suffering.
Destroy it.
If that makes sense. It's not, I don't know that avoid suffering is the right word. It's more that, if our suffering comes from desire, right? So, and it can be big. So for example, a lot of people who go through academic backgrounds, they often are really, really seeking that title of doctor at the end of the line. And there's a big desire to get there. And then once they're there, they often are a little disappointed in sort of the lack of fanfare of receiving that title. And it's not that we're trying to avoid that feeling, but that we don't need to feel it in the first place, because we need to be able to destroy the desire in the first place in Buddhism.
So can we have goals without desire?
I mean, that's a good question. I think that's complicated. I think that he shows that through the Buddha shows through his life that he has goals. There's a question, right? Does he desire Buddhahood? Right? Are goals and desires are they the same thing? I think that's a valid question. I think there may be a bit of a language barrier here. There's also a reason why we have both words. Desire is a type of want that I think is unable to be fulfilled. Really.
Oh, maybe I just missed a lot since I wasn't here last week. So thank you.
No, that thank you for asking. No, yeah. So it's the part of the destruction, if you will, of suffering is part of what makes different Buddhist groups different, you know, because they interpret some of these things a little differently from each other. I'm not going to go into the major weeds of that, but the idea that, you know, life is suffering, suffering is caused by desire, and we basically need to stop desire to stop suffering is really the key teaching. I also want to talk a little bit here. So this is a map of the area, and in the red here with Nepal, that's kind of the area that Siddhartha Gautama grew up in and lived most of his life. These three colors here, they represent different versions, different major schools of Buddhism, which we'll get into in just a minute. But I just want to raise awareness that we'll be talking about these a little bit. But we have Vajrayana, which is known as Tibetan Buddhism most of the time, that goes up into Tibet, China, and Mongolia. We have Mahayana Buddhism, which we'll talk about, which goes east into Japan and eastern China. And Theravada, which goes southeast into Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka. So just to kind of keep this in mind, because there's quite a bit of diversity based off of the region that we're looking at. And not only that, but also the schools. It's important to see how all these connect. So the three biggest schools are Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And Theravada literally translates to the school of elders. It's the oldest school of Buddhism. And the fundamental goal of Theravada Buddhism is the same as all the others in some ways. It's to reach enlightenment. To reach enlightenment, you pursue the path of the Arhat, which is basically a monk. It's a status of a monk who lives as the Buddha does a lot of meditation, often has a lot of readings of scriptures, and lives a fairly simple life in the monastery to be able to achieve Buddhahood. So Theravada is often what people think of when they think of Buddhism in many ways. It's not the largest school, but it's kind of that traditional school. One thing a lot of people don't realize about Buddhism that is different in many ways from a lot of religious traditions is there is a very clear break between those who are on the religious path and those who are kind of supporting those who are on the religious path. So you can be a monk, part of the Theravada school, and the community will often, donate food or money toward your ability to reach enlightenment. And by doing that fulfills their role, that they are doing good things, that they are leading themselves toward a path that will bring them closer toward a life that would allow them to achieve enlightenment. I know it's a lot of layers. So again, that there's this break between the monks and the community in many ways in Theravada Buddhism. The community supports the monks, and by supporting the monks, that is how they practice the religion. The Theravada Buddhists are the ones that do the vast majority of the meditation, scriptural readings, things along those lines. And that again is the Theravada one specifically. So So they focus on detaching from the self. They often are, while they live in, the Theravada monks live in community, they are practicing in a very solitary way. It's their responsibility to reach enlightenment for themselves. And, as I implied earlier, enlightenment is only accessible to the monks. Your goal as a community member would be to live a good enough life to be reborn in a situation that would allow you to be a monk. I think it's also important to understand that most Buddhist traditions have a variety of Buddhas. There's the Siddhartha Gautama is the most popular, the most well-known. He has the most stories, the most teachings, the most quotes. But even Siddhartha Gautama mentions other Buddhas in the past in some of his stories. And most Buddhists believe that there can be Buddhas, today, but they tend to not be as accepted today. It's kind of got a little bit of similarities to prophets in a way, where a lot of people don't. Many Christians believe that prophets could still exist, but they just don't, right? Depending on who you talk to. So the second school that we're going to talk about here is Mahayana, and it literally translates to the greater vehicle, which shows how they think of their school. They have a lot of school pride, and the vehicle piece is important because these are not considered extremely separate from each other. In some ways they are more like schools of thought or practices or paths, rather than completely separate sects. Sect is the best word I think we have for it, just because we just don't have the best words to describe how East Asian and South Asian religions really work in English. But it is important to know that while there is some competition, they still see each other as Buddhists. I just want to mention that. So, as Theravada has the Arhat, which is those individual monks who are trying to seek enlightenment on their own. A Bodhisattva is someone who seeks Buddhahood in the Mahayana tradition. It literally means seeker of enlightenment. And Bodhisattvas believe that, Mahayana Buddhists believe that enlightenment can be reached in your lifetime, regardless of your life situation. So that is a difference between Theravada. Theravada says that it's only really accessible to those who can be monks. And Mahayana sees it as, there are Mahayana monks, but enlightenment could be available to anybody. And there's a story of a bodhisattva where they have a belief that they want to achieve enlightenment. So the way that they achieve enlightenment is to ensure that all people have achieved enlightenment, which is a paradox, of course. And this sort of belief has led to very interesting developments, and I'll talk a little bit more about that with a different sect here, but I want to introduce it here. They too also have a variety of Buddhas, and I kind of want to mention this statue specifically. So this statue is of Guanyin, who many of you may have heard of if you know much about Japan or China also. She is a goddess, but she's also considered a Buddha. And if you notice in this situation, she is not meditating. In this pose of this Theravada Buddhist, we have him meditating. He's happy, but he is in a meditative pose, a more passive, solitary, thoughtful pose. And in Mahayana Buddhism, it's a little more action-oriented, that you can participate a little more in the world and still achieve enlightenment. And so the third major tradition is Vajrayana, or it's usually considered Tibetan Buddhism. Sorry? Someone say something? Okay. So in this picture to the right is the Dalai Lama, as many of you know, who's sort of the head of Tibetan Buddhism. And they believe that there's only one Dalai Lama at a time, but that same Dalai Lama reincarnates and continues to lead the church, or not the church, the organization. So when the Dalai Lama does eventually pass, they will look for signs in a child who will become the next Dalai Lama, sort of as finding that he would reincarnate in another person. So Vajrayana literally means thunderbolt vehicle, because they often describe that their path is the fastest. It happens like a thunderbolt. And as I mentioned before, Buddhism's sects are complicated, and they're different from Abrahamic religion sects, where the traditions, I think, are a little bit clearly separated from each other. Vajrayana is sometimes seen as sort of a subgroup of Mahayana. Sometimes it's seen as its own. They have a lot in common about some of those core beliefs, like that they have a goal for all people to be enlightened in some way, and that people can be enlightened in their lifetime. But the thing that really makes Vajrayana different is that they have sort of secret teachings. These teachings are passed between the teacher and the student, and they're meant to be kind of secretive. They're meant to be special. You will often see, if you don't have a lot of experience with this, you'll see Tibetan Buddhists pretty often at a lot of like religion conferences and things like that. It's pretty common if you see Buddhists working on like a sand mandala. They are probably from a Tibetan group. So I'm not sure if some of you have seen that, but that's pretty common. And another thing that makes Vajrayana a little bit different is that while the other two traditions do have many Buddhas, Vajrayana has Buddhas and deities. And these deities are, that's something that is very different. Much of Buddhism kind of ignores the existence of deities. That's partially why you might see people who practice both Buddhism and another tradition, is because, the deity is not that important in Buddhism most of the time, but in Vajrayana it's a little more important. All right. So I also want to talk about a couple other sizable traditions. So Zen Buddhism, which is what probably most of you have heard the most about. And, Zen Buddhism became particularly popular in the early 20th century in America. There was a Buddhist missionary named Yuki who came and kind of spread Zen Buddhism. And Zen is known the most for meditation, and that's a lot of that is because when people first join the tradition, that is what is available as a religious practice. But one thing that I think is particularly interesting about Zen is the koans. Have any of you heard of the koans before? They are basically riddles. I have one example here, and I'd like to share a couple more with you. But what is the sound of one hand clapping? So the goal of these questions is not to provide an answer, but to really focus deeply on, to some extent, an unanswerable question, so that you can focus your meditation and kind of, in some sense, kind of break your brain to be able to, get rid of the things around you by focusing so hard on this complicated question. I'd like to share something here. One second. So does anyone have any questions right now?
Jeremy, it's Nancy. I was wondering, as I've listened to so many of their beliefs, I wondered if this is tied a lot to letting go of ego. Is that, do you see that as something prevalent or dominant?
Yeah. So one of the very popular beliefs is that part of desire is the fact that we center ourselves in the world. So, if you can kind of de-center yourself from your life, you are not the most important thing anymore in that life, then you're able to kind of push desire away, because the desire, I don't think most people call it desire when they're talking about what they hope for other people. They're if you hope it to an unhealthy extent for yourself, that's desire in some ways, and hoping for others, or nothing, I guess. You sort of decenter yourself away from the ego, if you will. So there is a Zen temple in Omaha, and when some of these issues with the pandemic kind of die down, I definitely encourage you all to go. They have some beginner classes and stuff, and they're open to everybody. I also show you the tradition after that I am mentioning here. That is called Nichiren Buddhism. And Nichiren focuses on one specific text, and it's called the Lotus Sutra. And the Lotus Sutra is kind of a mystical text, and I would encourage you to read it if you want to kind of have an idea of how Buddhist scriptures go. But the Lotus Sutra claims that everything you need to know toward enlightenment is in this text. And in Nichiren, which is named after a specific teacher named Nichiren, he argues that really what you need is faith that the text provides those answers. So one of the most popular forms of Nichiren today is called Soka Gakkai, which we actually have a Soka Gakkai international temple community building in Omaha also. And let me show you some of their chanting really quick, if I can figure out how I'm supposed to do that. All right. Let's see. Can you hear that? Yeah. Here, let's see. So there's a deep intentionality to chant, and you chant in a single tone, a monotone, intentionally, to kind of get the vibe, if you will, of the meaning, and sort of get into a trance about the words and about the teachings within them. And there's a lot of mysticism in certain forms of Buddhism that is kind of like that. You know, it's like repeating the Lotus Sutra has power in itself. It's not just knowing the words and the teaching. It's saying them has some influence over sort of your spiritual life, if you will. In Tibetan Buddhism, for example, also, they have a thing called a prayer wheel. I don't know if anyone has seen those, but maybe I can show a picture. But a prayer wheel has an entire Buddhist prayer on it. And the idea is if you spin the wheel, the world kind of does the prayer, because the prayer moves, around in a circle like that. It's, let me see if we can find that really quick also. But I can't find a great video quick enough. But I think that it's important to see, that you have Theravada, who is seen as kind of the conservative traditional sect, right? It's all about the meditation. There's monks. It kind of fits all those categories that you imagine about Buddhism. And then you have all these other forms that pop up that all have the same goals, right? They still have the goal of reducing desire. They also have the goals of fulfilling the Eightfold Path. And I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint again really quick. But they just see them differently. And I also want to talk about this last sect here, which is also Pure Land Buddhism. And this is, I feel like I'm probably putting way too much information on your guys' plates here. But Pure Land Buddhism, I'm going to oversimplify that, if you believe that life is suffering and it has something to do with desire, then how are you supposed to get rid of desire in a world that's full of it? The Buddha Amitabha, which is a little bit later Buddha, he argues that you can't, and that there is another place where you can be reincarnated that allows you to reach enlightenment. So I do want to hear from all of you about any questions or comments you have about any of this. I know there's a lot of information. I went through it kind of quickly so far, but I want to make sure that I'm not speeding through too fast. You know, are there any questions about any of these things here?
When they say, this is Nancy, when they say life is suffering,
Mm-hmm.
does that come back to that we learn from our suffering, we learn from the problems that we go through and maybe overcome, or?
You know, I think that there's definitely a way to see that in this. Let me go back to it really quick. So when it comes to suffering, you know, again, the goal in Buddhism is it's not to avoid suffering, but to improve yourself to a place where you don't suffer anymore. And you may do that through what you learn about in your experiences. So I think that's a good point. You know, and there's also some things that, you know, people are just going to disagree with, right? Some people may believe that there's nothing to learn from suffering. But I think that most Buddhists would agree with what you're saying there. I also know that there was just a couple things about kind of earlier Buddhist history. So very early on, 300 BC, the kind of emperor in the area ended up adopting Buddhism, and so we have Buddhism as a religion of an empire for a short time in world history, and you know that a lot of Buddhist history actually has quite a bit of you know, recognizing and different affairs like that. And I think, you know, I mentioned this earlier that the depending on the space that you are in, Buddhism can be very different. You know, like, so there's that, and I'm going to complicate things, and I do this in some ways. You know, it's important to recognize that there's always diversity, even when we try to structure it. You know, so there's Zen Buddhism in Japan that has, you know, the meditation and the koans and all those things. When it came to South Korea, it became Shon, and it has kind of taken a life of its own. It's kind of like South Korean Zen Buddhism, and in China, it's called Chan, and it has taken up its own life. And Chan Buddhism has adopted parts of Taoism and Confucianism and things like that. And one of the pieces I meant to say about the early ancient history is that very early on, when Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism were all important in China, and Buddhism was coming in kind of new, many of the Confucianists were highly critical of Buddhism, mostly because they saw Buddhism as kind of a sad religion. They thought that, you know, their focus on suffering is not good for the well-being of people. Now, over time, they realized that there's actually a lot of beauty and potential for happiness in the context of Buddhism, but people have had that criticism in the past as well. So Carmela says another way to look at this statement is if you accept life with all the good or bad that comes with it and see it as all good, then life becomes less stressful, which removes the suffering feeling of our negative events. Yeah, that's a good point. You know, if you if you take life with some positivity, then it is more difficult to suffer. If you're able to sort of see the good in a lot of things, there is some value to that for reducing the suffering in your life. So just a couple other little trivia things. The most famous Soka Gakkai member is Orlando Bloom. Orlando Bloom is part of the Soka Gakkai Buddhist tradition. Soka Gakkai in particular has become very popular in the West. It has been seen as very progressive. For example, they fought for gay marriage back in like 2006. They have pretty socially, ethnically, and gender diverse population in their congregations, if you will. So, all these things are very different. So Soka Gakkai, if you were to go to one of those, you would see more diversity than maybe you would with a Pure Land Buddhist organization. One thing I didn't put in the PowerPoint also is holidays. And that's basically because they're very complicated with Buddhism. There are Buddhist calendars, but all of these different sects have different holidays. There are some shared holidays. Just last month, there was Buddha Day, which is sort of the birthday of the Buddha, which is practiced radically different depending on whatever tradition they're in. I think a lot of people think of Christianity in particular as diverse, but I would argue that Buddhism has a lot more diversity in thought and practice than a lot of traditions. It's very surprising to a wide variety of people who learn about Buddhism. So, I've kind of gone through the information a little quicker than I expected, but I would like to also talk about a couple of books and authors that I do suggest for anyone who would like to read a little more to read, and I can show you a couple of those. So, The Life of the Buddha by Shogyel. This is an older text that's translated. I'm going to stop sharing. So, Penguin Classics, the Buddhist scriptures. There's some new translations and new publications of this. But this is the one that I would say gives you the broadest understanding of Buddhism as it pertains to the life of the Buddha. Okay. And then I also would suggest the Lotus Sutra if you're going to look at a scripture. They are hard to read. Buddhist scriptures are very hard to read. They tend to be kind of esoteric or mystical, and use quite a few words that can't easily be translated, so they often are kept in Sanskrit, which is one of the languages of Buddhism. Yeah, I'll reshare that. Okay, I'll bring that back up. All right, can you see that? Can you see the slides again? Yeah, so the Lotus Sutra is what was being chanted that I played for a short amount of time. And it's probably the most widely dispersed text. Something to know about Buddhism is that there is no centralized text. There are many texts, and there are some that are very popular among certain groups of Buddhists, but there is no unifying Buddhist text that all Buddhists use. Lotus Sutra is used by the various groups within the Mahayana school of thought. By and large, most of those groups do look at it, at least some. And then with Theravada, there's a collection of texts called the Pali Canon. Pali is a language. It basically just means the Pali books. That's even harder to read than the Lotus Sutra. And then the other book that I would specifically suggest is Buddha by Karen Armstrong, which looks like this. You can see that. It's got a bust of the Buddha on the front. It's a very nice one, and this one also is very much about the life of the Buddha, and with a little bit about how the life of the Buddha applies to, today, basically. Like she talks a little bit about how certain teachings lend themselves to, meditation or something along those lines. And then if you're interested in more of like a spiritual approach, something where you want to think from more the perspective of Buddhists. Thich Nhat Hanh is pretty popular among Zen Buddhists. He maybe many of you already have a book of his. I have this one, which is The World We Have. It's kind of about peace and the environment. He has a variety of books, and those are pretty good. The Dalai Lama also has a few books, including a couple that talk about the importance of interfaith relationships. And Pema Chodron, who's also quite popular. She is a Tibetan nun Buddhist, and her books are widely available as well. I would say that those two, Thich Nhat Hanh and Pema Chodron, are the most popular for sure. And then the last piece here is if you're looking for a reference book on these religions, I think Houston Smith's The World Religions is pretty good. It kind of has a textbook approach, and I think it goes through the largest religions, including Buddhism. He does a good job of expressing them in ways that Westerners can understand, I think, better than some. And then Rabinowitz and Tobin's Religion in America. It's not just about America. This big thing. This is actually out of print now, but you can get it used online for pretty cheap. This one's more like a reference book where you can look up rites and rituals, a timeline, some major figures, things like that. This is one of my favorite reference books, and I am sad that they don't print it, because I wanted to use it for some classes when I was teaching at college. But if anyone has any other questions, we are open to any discussion. But otherwise, that's all the information I have for you today. Was anyone surprised at the modern kind of secular sound to this list of things that you're not supposed to accept as authority on their own?
This is Nancy. I think that's a good guide for us as we go through all this racial stuff that I hope is going to really lead to some change. But so many people are saying things that need to be checked out, and because there's so much misunderstanding.
Right. Yeah, it's true. And I hope we can figure out ways to, come together as a wide variety of approaches, right? This is going to take, to really find a long-term peace. It's going to take law, it's going to take social change. It's going to take change in our individual one-on-one relationships. It's going to take changes in how we interact with strangers, and quite a few other things. So it'll definitely take time and multiple approaches to get there. Yeah. Well,
Jeremy, is it possible for you to print that list of things and email it to us? Or I'd just like to print that off and have it.
Yeah, here. Yeah, is that I can send a follow-up email with a link to, well, I'll just put in the list of books, and yeah, I can do that. Also, I would like to ask, before everyone leaves here, I would like anyone who's available to fill out the Survey Monkey. Oh, whoops.